Hello and welcome back. In this demonstration here, what we're going to do is create the host pool for our Windows Virtual Desktop deployment, and we're going to do it using the Azure portal. So what I'm going to do here is from my home page here, what I want to do is browse to Windows Virtual Desktop. Now I have it listed in Azure Services because I've used it before. If you don't see it in your own subscription, you can search for it up here. So we'll go ahead and select Windows Virtual Desktop. It's kind of amazing because we're halfway through or maybe 2/3 of the way through this course, and we're just now getting to the actual deployment of Windows Virtual Desktop. That tells you there's a lot that goes on under the covers from a preparation standpoint. And that's usually the case in any type of deployment, is the actual prep work for that deployment. Now from this Windows Virtual Desktop overview page, we can manage host pools, application groups, workspaces, and even users. What we're going to do here is create the host pool. Now this host pool is the pool of VMs that's going to host the applications and the desktops that we're going to make available to our users. So we'll go ahead and create the host pool. And what we need to do is specify some basic information, some VM information, and then we need to configure the workspace. So let's walk through this here. We're going to deploy this host pool in the Burks Bikes LLC subscription. And again, we'll put everything in the WVD Lab resource group here. We need to give our host pool a name. We'll call this WVD host pool. And we'll deploy into East US. Now the option here for validation, this validation option allows us to create a validation host pool that allows us to test service changes before we get deploying them into production. We're not doing any kind of validation here, so we'll leave this no. Now this host pool type dropdown allows us to specify a personal pool type or a pooled pool type. Since we want our users to be able to access their user data, we'll use a pooled pool type. And when we do that, we can specify a max session limit and a load balancing algorithm. The max session limit, as we can see here, essentially is the max number of users that can have concurrent sessions on any particular host. I'm just going to set this to a max of 5 for this lab. We're not going to have 5 people logged in at once, so I'll keep it small. And then the load balancing algorithm here actually gives us a couple different options. If we select the drop-down, we have breadth first or depth first. Hovering back over this icon here, we can see that the breadth first load balancing option allows us to distribute new user sessions across all available session hosts in the pool. Now, the depth first option distributes new user sessions to whatever available session host has the highest number of connections but has not yet reached its maximum session limit. For this lab here, we'll leave this set to breadth first, and then we'll click through to virtual machines. Now what we're going to do here is set this to yes, and what this does is allow us to add virtual machines to the pool. Now the default virtual machine size here for this pool would be a standard D2S V3. I typically change this for my labs to the DS2 V2 just because I'm trying to conserve on cost since it is a lab environment. So we're going to select this DS2 V2 from the list. We can see it changes. And now this number of VMs box is the number of VMs we want to deploy into this pool. For this demonstration here, we're just going to deploy 2 of them. Now, speaking of the number of VMs, I should note here, if you're using a trial Azure subscription to follow along with these exercises, you may have a problem deploying this pool because you may hit your quota for number of CPUs in your region. And this is because Microsoft limits the number of cores you can deploy in a trial subscription. As a matter of fact, they even limit the number of cores you can deploy in a pay-as-you-go subscription. Sometimes you actually have to ask Microsoft to bump that quota up. So keep that in mind. If you follow along with this in your own environment and this deployment fails and it talks about quotas, that's because you're using a trial Azure subscription. So you may want to upgrade to pay as you go so you get an increased quota that will allow you to perform this exercise. Your mileage may vary, so just a heads up in case you see that. Now, what we also need to do here is provide a name for our session hosts. So this is actually a name prefix. So we'll call this WVD VM pool. Now, the image type here allows us to choose a gallery image or a custom image from a storage blob. We're going to deploy the gallery images. And when we select gallery, these are the images that become available to us. So what I'm going to do for this demonstration, since we have the Microsoft 365 apps licensed, we're going to select the Windows 10 Enterprise Multi-Session version 1909 plus Microsoft 365 apps. Essentially what this does is deploy a Windows 10 Enterprise deployment, and it also installs the Microsoft 365 apps for us. So we don't have to go in and install them ourselves. Now, once we select our image here, we have the OS disk type for the VMs that get spun up. I'm going to change this to standard HDD. Again, in a production environment, you probably want to use SSD because it's faster. But this is a lab environment. I'm trying to save on costs, so a standard HDD is more than sufficient for what we're doing here. Just keep that in mind if you're doing this in a production environment. And now under network and security, we need to tell Azure where we're going to deploy our VMs to. Now, we're not going to deploy to the Azure AD Domain Services VNet. What we want to do here is select the VNet WVD that we provisioned earlier. And if we select the drop down here, we can see what subnets are available. We only defined the single subnet on this virtual network, so that's where we're going to deploy to. We do not need a public IP for our VMs. We can leave the network security group set to basic. We leave the public inbound ports turned off. Now, the option here to specify a domain or unit, if we hover over here, tells us that we want to set this to yes if we want to join the virtual machines to a specific domain. What I'm going to do here is turn this on and tell Azure that I want to join the burksbikes.com domain when these VMs get spun up. I'll leave the OU path empty. I don't need to specify an OU for it. And then under here, we need to specify the admin account that will allow us to join these machines to our Azure AD domain services. Now, this account here will be the AADDS admin account that we created earlier. Now, I'm going to go ahead and copy this from a notepad here. We're using this account because it's an admin account for the domain services. This account will allow us to join these machines to the Azure AD domain services domain of burksbikes.com. And then we need to provide the password and confirm it. Again, remember, we logged in with this AADDSS admin account early on to force the sync of the password hash. So the password you're going to provide here isn't the initial password you set up when you provisioned the account. It's going to be that password you changed it to when you logged in with it. So we'll go ahead and enter the password here. And then we'll click through to configure the workspace. And essentially what we'll do here is register our desktop app group. And we don't have a workspace defined yet. So what we'll do is we'll create a new one and we'll call it Burks Bikes Workspace. Now you'll notice here you can't have spaces in between words. And we'll OK this. We're not going to do any tagging here. So we'll go ahead and review and create. And we can see our validation has passed. It's successful. So at this point, we can go ahead and create the host pool. Now, this process is probably going to take a good 15 minutes or so. Remember, it's spinning up some infrastructure, it's spinning up VMs, it's doing a lot of stuff under the covers to get this deployment up and running. So what we'll do here is we'll take a break, and I'll see you in the next lesson, and I'll show you what this looks like when it's been completed. And then from there, we will assign the desktop application group to a test user.